All right, let's go ahead and begin our week 2 lecture, Texas history. We're going to be talking about the past, present, and future. There's several key themes that we're going to talk about this week, but the main one is that the story of Texas is a story of its people. Immigration is a constant theme of Texas. Texas has consistently experienced immigration from the very beginning and up to current day. Immigration is still a huge issue here in Texas. And with all this immigration, the demographics of Texas have changed consistently throughout history. When we first began, we started with just Native American populations. Then the Spaniards came, then the French, and then the Americans. The demographics, the demographical cultural makeup of Texas has consistently changed. And with each change, and even with each new shift in population, it seems to signify a new era. Every new era in Texas history is defined by a new people arriving into Texas. Because of this, Texas has experienced this consistent kind of clash of cultures. There's the old versus the new, and then when the new becomes the old, then a new population steps in, and now that once new population is then now the old population. So there's just this clash of old and new, this consistent clash of cultures between the established residents of Texas and then the newcomers, the new residents of Texas. But really, all of this consistent clash of cultures really makes Texas history very, very unique. And there's really few states that really relish its history like Texas does. Texas has a very interesting, fascinating history, and Texas really values how unique its history is. So we're going to go ahead and begin. We're going to begin way, way long before you and I were even a thought in anyone's mind, and 2,000 years ago when humans first migrated across the Bering Strait. The Bering Strait was the land bridge from eastern Russia that was solidified, very solid ice, so that people could cross from eastern Russia into modern-day Alaska. And that was their very first arrival, the humans' very first noted arrival into North America. After they crossed the Bering Strait, they spread out through North America for thousands of years. You can imagine how slow travel time was back then. You had to walk everywhere. So they had to spread throughout the entire continent of North America, and it took thousands of years. So it took about, according to historians, the first Texans, I guess you would call them, arrived about 12,000 years ago. So you can see it took about 8,000 years to spread throughout North America all the way down into Texas. And that's why historians estimate about 12,000 years ago the first people arrived in what is current-day Texas. These were mainly hunting and gathering societies. The very primitive Native American tribes were mainly hunting and gathering societies, the majority of them. And the main tribe here in Texas was the Caddo people. The Caddo people populated a lot of West and North Texas, and even spread into Eastern Texas as well. They were an extensive network of tribes. So there was a lot of individual tribes, a lot of individual localities, I guess you would call them, with their own politics. But they had such an extensive network, and they could communicate effectively, so that they ruled a large amount of land, just like the Romans did in Europe and then in the Arab Middle Eastern world. The Caddo people had this extensive network, so they were basically the Romans of Texas, as the textbook calls them. Other tribes dominated other regions of Texas, so the Gulf in the south and the lands near the current border of current-day Mexico were different other tribes. Some of the names kind of slip me or are difficult to pronounce, so the main thing to know for your test is just that the Caddo people were the largest tribe, but then other tribes also dominated other regions of Texas. Native American tribes dominated Texas for millennia, for thousands of years. They arrived 12,000 years ago, and the first Europeans did not arrive until about 500 years ago, 600 years ago, in current history. So they dominated Texas for millennia, for thousands of years, largely undisturbed. And I'm sure there was a lot of history that went on, a lot of different types of politics that went on between these Native American tribes. Unfortunately, not a lot of that is recorded. So what we do know is that the Europeans were the very first, or the Spanish were the very first Europeans to come into Texas. So the Native Americans established themselves in Texas, and now which is the current theme of Texas, is that there's always newcomers arriving to Texas. There's always a change. There's always a migration into Texas. And the Spanish were the very first Europeans to do that. So the first great change to Texas in thousands of years occurred with the arrival of Christopher Columbus into the New World. When Christopher Columbus arrived in the New World, the European and the Spanish Empire specifically were able to spread throughout the Caribbean, Central America, South America as well, and into the Southwest United States. So the Spanish Empire influenced a lot of these regions, and that's why you see a lot of Spanish culture still present in Latin America and then also in the Southwest United States of America. But the main quest for the Spanish were to seek the 7 cities of gold. The 7 cities of gold were these mythical kind of stories of legend that you would arrive in these 7 cities. There were these 7 cities spread throughout the New World that were made of gold. They had tons of riches, tons of treasure for the Spanish to try to take. The Spanish, though, thought them to be in the modern-day Midwest. I know myself, I'm from Kansas, and we often heard of Cortez and his conquistadors trying to seek out the 7 cities of gold in Kansas. Kansas was actually one of the locations that was thought to be the 7 cities of gold, as well as Nebraska, as well as Ohio, a lot of Illinois, Iowa, a lot of the Midwest region. And so the Spanish thought the best way to do this was to go through Central America up to the southwest of the United States of America and then continue north. So therefore, Texas was a gateway to these 7 cities. So you had the Spanish coming into Texas on their way north to seek the 7 cities of gold. And that's why Texas is largely influenced by Spanish culture. The Spanish conquistadors would travel through Texas. They would give different sorts of gifts, different sorts of cultural items from their own culture to the Native American populations, including the horse. You can imagine that these Native American populations never even seen a horse before the Spanish arrived. The Spanish actually introduced the horse into Native America. And the Spanish would also set up these settlements along throughout Texas, throughout the network of Texas. And they engaged in Christianizing the native population. Now, this was wildly unpopular among the native population. Not a lot of them went along with the process of Christianizing. But the Spanish were also introduced their religion, their Catholic religion, into the Southwest and into Latin America today. But the Spanish established themselves in established themselves in Texas, and so then they became the establishment. They became the residents of Texas. And so now that they're the established ones, they're the ones that are suspicious of any newcomers. So as soon as they established themselves in Texas, they thought, hey, this is nice. We're kind of getting along with the Native American populations, even though the Native American populations were suspicious of us when we arrived. Well, now that we're established, we're becoming suspicious of any newcomers. And the newcomers came in the form of the French. The French were wildly invested in exploring America and adventuring throughout America. The French saw what the Spanish were doing, that the Spanish were able to colonize and expand their empire, and the French wanted to do largely the same. French adventures into Texas were brief. They didn't really show up for a long period of time, but they were very interested in exploring the New World, and Texas was part of that. And largely the French were unsuccessful at colonizing a lot of places. However, the French really did value the Gulf region of Texas, and they also valued many cities along the Mississippi. This is why when you look at the Mississippi River, you see a lot of towns along the Mississippi River, and a lot of them are by French names. For example, St. Louis. St. Louis is named after the French king Louis XIV. That's why a lot of the towns along the Mississippi are considered to be French. And they also liked the Gulf region. The Gulf region allowed the Mississippi allowed them to ship their items, and the Gulf allowed them to ship them back out to Europe. So therefore, much of the Texas Gulf, much of the Texas Gulf Coast experienced the influence of French culture. But the Spanish looked at the French being suspicious of newcomers, and they felt threatened by the French. And so the Spanish said, hey, if the French are going to be in East Texas, we also need to expand our empire into East Texas as well. So that's why in East Texas, especially in East Texas and along the Gulf Coast, you see this weird kind of mix, this unique mix of Spanish and French cultures. And it's because the French were arriving into Texas and the Spanish felt threatened, so the Spanish needed to move east as well. The French largely left East Texas, left it to the Spanish, and the Spanish were able to colonize much of Texas. But as the Spanish colonized Texas, a new nation forms in the East, and this is the Americans. The United States of America established itself in 1790 and was almost instantly, 1789, but was almost instantly interested in expanding westward. And therefore you see this clash between Spanish and American cultures. Americans are estimated to arrive in Texas around 1790s. There was a lot of land, there was a lot of open land, and so therefore it served agrarian interest, agricultural interest. But the Spanish really didn't like this. They didn't like that the Americans were coming in and that they were taking over this land and farming it and ranching it under what is marked as Spanish territory, but it's a profit for the American government, paying taxes and aggrandizing land. So the Spanish tried to impede the flow of Americans. Ultimately, the Spanish ended up granting access to Americans. There were so many Americans moving westward, and it was impossible for the Spanish government to stop the Americans from coming in. So the Spanish just kind of gave up. The Spanish were also at this time stretched very thin. The Spanish were struggling economically, and they were fighting wars in Europe, and so they had to fund those, and they couldn't really tend to their colonies worldwide. So these new settlers were granted access by the Spanish, and they set up colonies on Spanish territory. They were basically they were under the American flag. They paid taxes to the American government, but they were on Spanish territory. And these settlements ended up actually being very successful economically, and their influence was really undeniable. So now that they're prospering economically, now that they're making money and sending it back to the American government is becoming stronger. But also are these little towns. They're introducing new populations, they're making money, and they're able to sustain themselves, which makes more Americans want to come into the colonies. And the Spanish don't really like this. But that being said, for all the worth it was that they didn't like it, the Spanish were becoming unable to control their colonies. Like I said, they suffered economically. They were fighting wars. Their military was stretched thin. And the Texans, or the people that were inhabiting Texas, really said, hey, Spain can't really do much to us. We should really just become independent. We're able to sustain ourselves, and we're able to survive economically. So that being said, the Call of Hidalgo launches the Mexican War of Independence. Mexico wants to become its own independent nation, and Mexico actually succeeds in this independence movement. Mexico succeeds in separating from Spanish rule. Now, Texas at this time is marked under Spanish territory, and it was also marked within the borders of Mexico. So Texas was actually part of Mexico as soon as Mexico became independent. You still had the American settlers there, but you had the American settlers, instead of being under Spanish rule, are now under Mexican rule. And the new Mexican government was really hopeful that this wave of American settlers, sorry for the typo there, but the new Mexican government was really hopeful that these wave of American settlers would become loyal to the Mexican government. They would cross into the Mexican border, and as soon as they were established, lived within the Mexican territory, that they would actually swear loyalty to the Mexican government. Unfortunately, they're still American citizens. And so you now have this clash, where you have this clash of cultures between the Mexican government and the American settlers who are moving westward. You have this clash of cultures along religious lines. Traditionally, the Mexican government promoted Catholicism, as is tradition with a lot of Spanish colonies, whereas the American settlers were much more Protestant, coming from the Puritan tradition. If you know basic American history, you know that the Puritans were the Protestants that first arrived into America, and Protestantism and Puritanism still really actually existed among the American settlers. It was really embedded with the American settlers at this time. So you had this clash along religious lines among Catholicism and Protestantism. You also had a clash of cultures along language. So with the American settlers, you had a very diverse set of languages. You had Germans, you had Polish, you had Swedish, you had English, obviously, as well. Whereas the Mexican government had an official language of Spanish because of their Spanish colonial role. So you had Spanish versus English versus a large amount of other types of languages. And so there was this clash of culture along languages as well. And there was a large language barrier present in Texas during this time. And you also had a clash of cultures along slavery. Now this one is kind of ironic in many ways, but slavery was actually denounced by the Mexican government. But the American settlers, being largely agricultural landowners, and saw the goodness of the land in Texas, needed those slaves to become successfully economically. So the Mexican government in many ways denounced slavery, whereas the this wave of American settlers, these new American settlers, actually I wouldn't say promoted slavery, but at least thought that they needed slavery for agricultural interest. So there was a clash of cultures among views on slavery, whether it was acceptable or not, and this also led to some tensions between the Mexican and American settlers. But that doesn't stop the American settlers from coming into Texas, and the population of Texas increases immensely during this time because Americans are pushing forward, pushing westward. So Mexico becomes independent, but really clashes with the established American settlers and those colonies run by American settlers in Texas. And the settlers in Texas are largely dissatisfied with the Mexican government because of these cultural barriers. And this dissatisfaction only grew as Mexico was establishing itself as a new nation. Texas was dissatisfied with the new nation of the Mexican government. So, that being said, Mexico, as this dissatisfaction is growing, Mexico attempts to centralize its government. And what I mean by that is to give power away from its states and from its colonies. Mexico attempts to have just a central government where the federal government says what goes and what doesn't. You can imagine this in the United States if, let's say in the United States, that all state governments were wiped away and the federal government was the only government that governed in America. That's exactly what happened in Mexico. Mexico took all the power away from its states and said the only power that there is resides in Mexico City with the dictator or with the president of that time. So Mexico attempts to centralize its government, take any political power away from its states, and Texans really don't like that either. But Texans aren't the only ones, quite honestly. Many Mexican states didn't like this idea that the central government only had power and that they were powerless. So this causes unrest in many Mexican states, the centralization of the government, and including Texas. But Texas is further out on the perimeter. They're not as close to the central government, and they have this American manifest destiny kind of attitude. So this creates a clash, and Texans are really unsatisfied and take up arms. And Gonzales is the very first incident of open warfare against the Mexican government. It's the very first battle, many textbooks would point to, of the Texas Revolution. Well, many Americans in other states also see that Texas is fighting the Mexican government, so Americans actually, this creates a new wave of American settlers. More Americans are coming into Texas to join this Texas Revolution. That way they can help in the war, and that way they can hopefully get a piece of their own land if they move to Texas. And if Texas becomes independent and they can say they fought in the war effort, they can probably get a nice plot of land. So Americans are flocking to Texas to help in the war. And the Texas Revolution really sees many, many famous battles. And I just have a brief note here of the Alamo. The Alamo is obviously one of the more historically important, or one of the most historically documented battles during the Texas Revolution, so I won't go into it. Obviously, I assume many of you being from Texas have at least studied it in some capacity, maybe in a high school course or elsewhere. And even for me, being out of state, obviously I heard of the Alamo quite a bit. The Texans hold this convention of 1836, and at this convention, they draft a Declaration of Independence, say we're separating from Mexico, we're establishing our own country as Texas, we're establishing the Republic of Texas. And they also at this convention elect their very first president and vice president, and Sam Houston ends up being the very first president. Like I said, way back when, many Mexican states were experiencing unrest, and so the Mexican army is really stretched thin at this point. They have to control unrest in this state, they have to control unrest in this state, and Texas, meanwhile, is gaining strength because more Americans are joining the effort. And so this stretching thin of the Mexican army allows the Texan army to finally go on the offensive. They see that there's holes that they can exploit in the Mexican army, and that there's only so many troops stationed here, stationed there, and elsewhere. And so the Texan army really goes on the offensive. This all ends at the Battle of San Jacinto. It's the famous place where the Texas independence movement really kind of came to a conclusion. But conflict between the two kind of continue in little sporadic things, and they don't really like each other politically. Obviously, Texas separating from Mexico didn't really have good relations with Mexico for quite a while, and much in the same way the United States didn't have good relations with England for many, many years after the United States separated from England. So Texas wins its independence during the Texas Revolution. If you want more information, there's an entire Wikipedia page on it. There's lots of information out there. But it's very, very unique that Texas is one of the few states to become its own country and to fight a war of independence against another government. But this leads to the Republic of Texas. They declared their independence. They won the battle. They won the battles, the war, I guess I should say. And Texas continued to experience the influx of Americans for many, many years, even after the Texas Revolution. Many people saw the fertile land in Texas and decided to establish their own farms, establish their own ranching operations as well. And because of this boom of population, they also brought with them a lot of their slaves, and slaves contributed to the booming population growth during this time. Unfortunately, under the Republic of Texas, especially the President Lamar, the second president of Texas, the native populations really suffered. The Texas government was continuing to conquer and seize the land of many Native American populations, but the population was still booming because of the slaves. And overall, the population nearly doubled. So many settlers would come westward into Texas, across the Louisiana Territory, and they would bring their slaves and their families with them, and really contribute to the growing population of Texas during this time. Unfortunately, Texas didn't really fare well being its own nation, and Texas really suffered economically. Even though people were moving in and trying to contribute to the economy, Texas suffered economically because of overspending, actually. President Lamar, the second president of Texas, increased Texas's debt to nearly $7 million. Now, even to date, $7 million sounds like a lot. In the 1830s and 1830s and 1840s, I can only imagine how much $7 million really was to them. I'm sure it was close to maybe $1 trillion or a little less than $1 trillion would be today. Also, Texas, being its own independent nation, had to establish its own currency. They could no longer use the Mexican currency, and the American currency wasn't accepted either. Texas had to establish its own currency, but it really struggled with that. It really struggled setting its own currency at a certain market value, and it really struggled setting exchange rates with both Mexico and the United States. You have the United States bordering it to the east, and you have Mexico bordering it to the south. It had to kind of test the market and see where its currency would be valued at. But it really struggled to do this, and all new nations really struggled to do this. But Texas, being in the Republic of Texas for nearly a decade, really could not establish its own currency during this time. Also, Texas suffered a lot of trade deficits. They weren't really exporting a whole lot. They exported some cotton and some fruit to Europe, but because they were trying to establish themselves, they had to really import a lot more than they were exporting, and so they were experiencing this trade deficit, much like the United States has today, where the United States imports a lot more than it exports because it doesn't manufacture a whole lot. Texas is struggling economically. They're having kind of an overpopulation problem, and the Texans kind of look to the east and say, what can the United States do for us? Maybe the United States can help us out. Annexation, meaning becoming a state into the United States, really became a hot political issue as a result. Texas really couldn't sustain itself, and so it really wanted to try to look elsewhere for help, and it wasn't going to look to the Mexican government because tensions were still very hot and wounds were still very fresh, and so many of the Texans, being former Americans, looked to the United States and said maybe we can become a state. And the annexation of Texas really took off in 1845 and 1846, and the annexation of Texas actually was a key interest to the United States. The United States was still interested in expanding westward. You have James K. Polk, he's the president of this time. James K. Polk really believed in the attitude of manifest destiny. Manifest destiny is just this idea that the United States will expand from coast to coast. And this was a really kind of an idea from the very founding of our nation, that the United States needs to expand westward. There's so much land, there's so much unclaimed territory, and it's really on the cheap. The Europeans can't maintain all this land in the New World, but we're a new country here in North America. We can actually do this. We can actually expand our empire, our nation, from coast to coast. And Texas was part of that. Texas was centrally located in the United States, had a lot of fertile land. It had a lot of American settlers already. So why can't the United States claim Texas for itself? And James K. Polk really made this a platform when he ran for president. So Polk is in office this time. He looks at Texas and says, we really need to annex it. We really need it to become a state. It can help us economically. It could help out. It would also help out Texas. So it's a good deal for both sides. There's a convention in Texas. Many of the Texas founders were at this convention. This convention was held on July 4th, 1845. And now this was obviously a symbolic gesture, signifying the United States independence as well. So convention is held on July 4th, 1845, and it approves annexation. Now, there's this whole process after annexation where it has to be approved by Congress, and there has to be sort of this debate kind of thing going on. But Texas formally enters the Union on February 19th, 1846. So Texas officially becomes a state on February 19th, 1846. Now, there's still kind of these issues with Mexico. Mexico really doesn't like how expansive and how powerful the United States is becoming right now. And so Mexico still believes that it kind of has a legitimate claim on Texas. And now there's this new kind of border dispute between the U.S. and Mexico. And the U.S. and Mexico actually go to war over this. President Polk wants the border to be at the Rio Grande, and then the Mexicans actually believe that their border is the Rio Nueces. And so if you look at a map, you can see the Rio Nueces and you can see the Rio Grande, and you can kind of see how there's a nice little strip of land there. And the United States, being the kind of powerful bully on the block now, says our border is at the Rio Grande, and Mexican borders that the Mexicans say no, and they clash. They have the Mexican-American War fought over where the border is, whether it's at the Rio Grande or whether it's at the Rio Grande or if it's at the Rio Nueces. So this border dispute continues. Ultimately, the U.S. wins. The Texans are riled up about this, so they're very powerful. They now have the backing of the United States Army, and the United States wins the Mexican-American War. And now the border is set, and it's been that way for nearly two centuries now. That being said, so now Texas is a state, but we all know that the United States couldn't really hold itself together during the 1850s and 1860s. I kind of struggled for a better term there, but it really struggled to hold itself together. Like I mentioned earlier, slavery was actually a vital part of the Texas economy. Slavery was used in agriculture for growing trees and growing other crops, fruit trees and other crops. Also, cotton was a very big part of the Texas economy at this time as well. So, also, Texas had an extensive shipping industry as well. You had an entire Gulf Coast where Texas could ship from, and it shipped many of its goods back to Europe. Now, when the Confederacy chooses to secede from the Union, Texas secedes along with the Confederacy. It's in the South. Slavery is important to its economy, And Texas believes in the power of the states and rather than the federal government. Because Texas was its own country at the one time, obviously they highly value independence. So pro-slavery Anglos really controlled the government at that time also. Many of the powerful landowners were serving in the government of Texas at that time. So obviously they voted to secede with the Confederacy. There's many things that led to Texas siding with the Confederacy, including their economy and those who controlled government. But that being said, many Texans didn't really believe in slavery, really didn't support slavery, and among those were the free blacks. Obviously, the free blacks weren't going to go back into slavery. They opposed slavery in all forms. You also had the Germans. The Germans were a unique ethnic group at that time in America that their culture did not believe in slavery. So many Germans actually left Texas, left the Confederate States, and joined the Union. Also, you had Tejanos. Tejanos were native Mexicans who were living in Texas at that time that Texas was independent, and they were still living in Texas. The Tejano population was still quite large at this time, and the Tejanos were worried about being enslaved themselves. They tended to be on the lower scale of the economy. They were maybe paid a living wage, not much more than that, and so they were also worried about being sold into slavery themselves, and so they also tended to side with the Union. But Texas was controlled by pro-slavery Anglos, so Texas seceded with the Confederacy. Many of those that disagreed with slavery left and joined the Union or lived in Union states. So Texas secedes, joins the Confederacy, and is thrown into the Civil War, being part of the Confederacy. And Texas actually experienced many Civil War battles. Obviously, we all know, reading basic U.S. history, the Union wins, the Confederacy loses. And this kind of creates a unique scene in Texas. So for decades after the Civil War, Texas continued to experience its clash of cultures. You had a lot of racial tension, obviously. You had these old Confederates who no longer could own slaves or could no longer were no longer completely in power. There was new rights granted to minority populations at that time. So the pro-slavery Anglos feeling their power being threatened really kind of ramped up racial tensions. Racial tensions were really common in Texas. Texas had a large influence of the Ku Klux Klan. A lot of free blacks were terrorized at this time. You had the establishment of Jim Crow laws, which were laws put in place so that blacks and minority populations at that time could not vote, and even though they were guaranteed these new rights under the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment, the Jim Crow laws made sure that those freed blacks or those blacks now granted those certain rights couldn't actually vote. You also had an influence of carpetbaggers. Carpetbaggers were Northerners who came into Texas now, but were really kind of terrorized and really discriminated against because they were Northerners and they were pro-Union, that they were anti-slavery. These Northerners, these Anglo Northerners that were trying to come in and enforce the new laws were really terrorized because the Texans kind of felt that these Northerners didn't really know their culture and couldn't really tell them what to do and what not to do. You still had the flow of immigrants from Mexico. That created a lot of racial tension as well. You also had farmers and land prospectors coming in. You had those that were of minority status, many of them black, former farmers themselves, trying to get a piece of land in Texas and trying to establish kind of a life of their own, a farm of their own. But that being said, that was very unpopular and also increased racial tensions. Then you also had railroad workers. So railroad workers were largely Asian Americans, Chinese Americans, and Japanese Americans trying to build the railroad networks in Texas. But they're of a different race. They're of a minority status. And so Anglos really felt threatened at this time. There was a lot of clash of cultures going on in post-Civil War Texas. In just a few short decades, really, all of these racial tensions really kind of took off in Texas between the Ku Klux Klan, the whites, the Northerners, the Mexicans, the freed blacks, and then they also had the Asian Americans coming into Texas. So Texas at this time was experiencing this kind of paramount of cultures, and all of them really clashed with each other and didn't necessarily get along at this time. So Luckily, Texas kind of moved on a little bit, I should say, a little bit at a time. And Texas in the 20th century underwent enormous economic, social, and political change. So the Texas economy boomed in the 20th century. Texas was seen as this land of wealth, this land of opportunity. A lot of people moved in, once again contributing to the racial tensions. But that being said, if you're making money and you're allowing your family to continue on and prosper and be successful, it's worth taking that risk of moving into Texas. You had these new kind of sectors pop up in Texas, these new economic sectors. Texas used to be largely ranching and agrarian, agricultural type society, an agricultural type economy as well. But in the 20th century, you have oil production. Oil production takes off in Texas and becomes largely important to U.S. interest. So you have these people moving into Texas to try to make their wealth with oil, Texas gold. You also had the introduction of fruit. In the Gulf Coast, it was found that a lot of fruit trees would take off and contribute to the economy there. In East Texas, you had timber. Timber was very important. You had a large wooded area. The United States needed timber, and timber was very important to the economy. And in the 20th century, you also had new shipping ports. Being from this region, you can see how shipping played a huge important role in the economy here in Southeast Texas, in the Gulf Coast region, particularly Houston and Galveston. You also had highways. Highways were a new thing in the 20th century as well. No, not before then, there hadn't been cars and there hadn't been a need for highway systems. So people could easily come into Texas, get a job building highways in the 20th century. And then also contributing to the Texas economy in the 20th century was bootlegging. Prohibition was wildly popular in Texas. A lot of people didn't believe that alcohol should be sold, or even alcohol should be legal. So you had these bootleggers coming in selling their illegal alcohol, and this black market of alcohol actually really contributed to people moving into Texas and contributing to the economy of Texas. So you had this booming economy, and even though you still had this clash of cultures and these racial tensions, it was worth it to come to Texas to try to improve your economic standing and to partake in the new economic sectors that were now booming in Texas. Also, Texas, being in the South, being a former Confederate state, was also a hotbed for civil rights movements. You obviously had the racial tensions, and you had the large social movements, the large civil rights movements, to try to increase rights for minorities at that time. And Texas was a hotbed for that, being in the South and having a lot of racial diversity. Texas contributed heavily to the civil rights movement in the 20th century. So 20th century Texas is very unique. There's a lot going on. There's a successful economy now. There's lots of historical and political events that happened in 20th century Texas. And all these things moving forward contribute to exactly what Texas is today. So let's go ahead and talk about the present. We've dealt enough with the past. Let's go ahead and talk about where Texas is today. And the truth is that the flow of newcomers, this flow of immigration, really hasn't stopped. Texas is still experiencing rapid population growth. And quite honestly, we're going to look at some charts here in just a little bit, but quite honestly, Texas is experiencing a population growth faster than any other state. It's amazing how rapidly Texas is growing currently. And I know myself, being from out of state, I'm actually contributing to the rapid population growth in Texas. Me and my significant other have moved to Texas, so there's two people that have moved to Texas. But the economy today still has that kind of unique mix. You have this unique mix of the agricultural tradition. For many centuries almost, Texas was an agriculture type of economy. You have the oil. The oil is still very highly present in Texas today. And Texas now is experiencing a growing technology and service sector. Many technology type companies and many service sector type companies are moving into Texas. And a large part of that has to do with the fact that Texas has no income tax. And so Texas is very appealing to companies that want to move in and not pay income tax. They can do that in Texas. And so these technology and service sector type of companies are really moving in to Texas. Unfortunately for Texas, even though you have this large population growth, income inequality is really pronounced here in Texas. Income inequality is really increasing. What I mean by that is that the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, basically. There's a huge gap between those that make the most and those that make the least. And unfortunately, there is not much of a middle class in Texas. Income inequality is really increasing at a rapid rate here in Texas. Although I would say that it's increasing almost everywhere in America. Income inequality is a huge problem for America, but it's definitely more pronounced here in Texas. But immigration into Texas continues. You have a lot of foreign immigrants coming from Mexico. You have a large wave of the Mexican population immigrating into Texas. And also, uniquely, Texas is experiencing a lot of immigration from Central and Eastern Europe. Texas has become a wildly popular place for Central and Eastern Europeans to migrate to. I'm not sure what explains that, but it is a very unique note. It's a very unique observation of what's happening here in Texas. Many people from out of state are moving to Texas, myself included, obviously, me and my girlfriend included in that. Because Texas is a land of opportunity. It still really is. There's a lot of jobs down here. There's a lot of opportunity for people like myself to get a job here in Texas. You have Austin. Austin is growing at a rapid rate. Austin is actually growing faster than any other city in the United States. So that's a very unique note, how fast Austin is growing and how Austin is having to adapt to how fast it is growing. So it'll be interesting to see whether they have the administrative kind of capacity to take on all these new populations. Also notable is that Texas has 4 of the 15 largest urban centers. Texas has 4 of the largest cities in the United States, 4 of the top 15 largest cities in the United States. You have Houston, you have Dallas, you have Austin, and San Antonio. I believe Houston is the 4th largest city in the United States. Dallas, the metropolitan area of Dallas, is the 5th largest when you consider all the suburbs and the suburban sprawl that's going on in Dallas. I know myself, I used to live in Denton, Texas, which is a suburb of Dallas, and I can just tell you how massive the suburbs are in Dallas. And then Austin, I believe, is the 11th, and San Antonio is the 14th. So it'll be interesting to see how Texas can really handle this growth of population, this growth of the urban population, the urbanization of Texas. Even though some out-of-staters tend to think of Texas as this agrarian type of society, this agricultural society with lots of land, the urban centers are really contributing to the growth of Texas. So let's go ahead and look at let's go ahead and break this down by racial and ethnic lines here. We're going to look at kind of the origins of the population, of the Texas population, and then we're going to look at a few interesting charts of how Texas is growing currently and things like that. So back in the very beginning, and we talked about how the Native Americans were the very first people to really settle Texas. Unfortunately, currently, there's very few Native American tribes within Texas. There's a few reservations, but really, the Native American population has really decreased quite a bit, unfortunately. But their legacy is substantial. There's still a lot of influence of Native American culture, especially when the Native Americans kind of clash with the Spanish culture. There's still a lot of influence of that type of mix of cultures there. I mentioned the Caddo people. They were the very first. They weren't the very first, but they were the largest extensive network of Native American tribes. And there's only 3 tribes on reservations in Texas. I'm not going to go ahead and try to pronounce those. I would say Alabama, Coushatta, Kickapoo, and Tigwa. Hopefully I'm pronouncing those right. But those are the 3 tribes with reservations here in Texas. And Texas has a very unique kind of debate going on with the controversy over gambling. Many Native American tribes that are placed on reservations traditionally are allowed to open casinos or gambling resorts. However, gambling is outlawed in Texas, which I always thought was very unique. But gambling is outlawed in Texas, and so therefore these Native American reservations are not allowed to open their own gambling facilities or their own casinos. And so the Native Americans are kind of denied access to that source of revenue, despite being on reservations. The next kind of group, the next big group that is really important to emphasize is the Hispanic population. Hispanics have the legacy of Spanish colonization. The Spanish were trying to Christianize the Hispanics at that time. So you had these 4 institutions. You had the Mission, the Presidio, the Rancho, and then you had different towns and various types of settlements. Many cultural norms and legal traditions are their legacy. They still have a lot of cultural norms, and you can kind of see that how many kind of Hispanic cultural norms are mixed into Texas culture today. Mexican colonization was relatively limited until 1890 and 1910. And today the Hispanics have a lot of political clout. The Hispanics are a very important demographic for Texas politics. If you want to win Texas, you really have to appeal to the Hispanic voters. The Hispanic vote is very important. The Hispanics have a lot of political clout. They have a lot of political kind of say-so with politicians. And Texas politicians have to consider the Hispanic population, how they're going to vote when they are campaigning and so forth. So Hispanics are immensely important to the history of Texas and also to the politics of Texas currently today. The next kind of group that is very important to the history of Texas is the Anglos, the non-Hispanic whites. As if you ever fill out a government form, you have to say non-Hispanic white, which I always thought was kind of interesting. But for the sake of the lecture today, we'll just call them Anglos. Anglos, like I said, as soon as the United States was settled, the Americans and the Anglos, they were interested in moving into Texas. And you had early settlements from 1815 to 1836 that were mostly Southerners from Tennessee, Kentucky, Arkansas, and North Carolina, and elsewhere. They were the ones that really brought the slave populations in, and they were the ones that really settled a lot of the land, a lot of the colonies. You had migration from the South after the Civil War. From the South, they moved into Texas because Texas was this land of opportunity. You had migration from the Midwest and the Northeast during the era of the Great Depression into the mid-1960s. And for the large part, Anglos have dominated politics. So Anglos are consistently moving into Texas, and not only are they consistently moving in Texas, they're also dominating Texas politics. They've really kind of held the reins of the apparatus of government, and they've held seats in legislature, they've held the governorship, they've held a lot of the court, the judicial type of positions as well, pretty much since their arrival. Since its independence from Mexico in 1836, Texans were Texas elected Anglos into office. Anglos from other states are currently migrating at an increasing rate and contributing to urban growth. So, sorry, but myself included, I am actually contributing to that urban growth, I guess, and that increasing rate of population growth here in Texas. Oh, sorry, forgive me. Someone walked into my office here, but moving on. We have also the African Americans. African Americans contribute a large part to the history of Texas. Sorry. African Americans, they inhabited Texas in Spanish rule almost. The Mexican government, interestingly, like I said, opposed slavery. But when slavery was legalized, population increased, but was kind of halted by the Civil War. So unfortunately, kind of a stick in history, I guess, would be that once slavery was legalized, when Texas became independent, they legalized slavery, and that increased the population of blacks and African Americans here in Texas. And still today, we have a large African American population, a very diverse population here in Texas. So outmigration from rural to urban areas due to agricultural and economic changes, the urban areas are still a very popular hub for migration of African Americans. Pretty much for all Texans, I would say urbanization has really taken off, regardless of ethnic or racial lines. And then finally, the Asian Americans. The Asian Americans still tend to be a very small sector of the population, not only in Texas, but in the United States in general. Not a lot of people identify as Asian Americans, but Asian Americans are very important to the history of the United States and to the history of Texas. So the first permanent Asian residents were mainly Chinese immigrants working on the railroads. The railroad was very important to Texas development and during the late 1800s. And many Asian Americans, including Chinese immigrants, began to work on the railroads. You had Japanese forming their own colonies in 1903, contributing to the Texas economy. And notably, many Vietnamese came to America during the Vietnam War, seeking refuge from the Vietnam War. So, analyzing the population today, analyzing this very unique mix of ethnic and racial kind of lines, the most significant growth, notably, has been among these racial and ethnic lines, but especially the Hispanic. The Hispanic population continues to grow in Texas, contributes to influence Texas in very, very unique and important ways. And the Hispanic population really does contribute to the overall economy. But notably, the Hispanic population is currently a lot younger than most. You have a lot of younger Hispanics here in Texas. Unfortunately, looking at the income inequality of Texas, you tend to notice that Hispanic populations tend to be less well educated and less economically well off. But they're the ones that contribute to kind of they're the cogs that make the machine turn, make the economy in Texas really turn. Texas in general, though, has one of the most diverse populations. Its population is growing younger and more progressive, and urbanization has grown exponentially. So this is going to be very interesting for the political landscape of Texas in years to come. The Hispanic population is younger, and they tend to be more progressive, and they tend to live in more urban centers. But that being said, across all racial and ethnic lines, you tend to see that. You tend to see Texas getting a lot younger. You tend to see the Texans get more progressive, and you tend to see them live in urban areas. So this will be very interesting for the political landscape, noting that these populations tend to be more progressive. You see kind of this idea that Texas may become blue. And what I mean by that is become more democratic. They might be a lot more democratic type voters are moving into Texas. This will be very interesting to see how this will play out between Republicans and Democrats in the future. So while Republicans still control many of the state offices, many actually do believe that Texas could turn blue, and there's some estimates within the next 5 years or within the next decade, we could see Texas become a blue state, or at least a mixed state of both Republicans and Democrats. You're going to have this huge kind of cultural, political ideology clash here in Texas very soon. It'll be very interesting to see how that plays out. So looking at these types of demographics is very important to how the political landscape of Texas is really, really shaped up, right, and how it's projected to be in the future. So I do believe, now we're going to go ahead and look at a few charts and kind of get an idea of how the population in Texas is really going to change. Now, this is charted. These are actually numbers of the population growth in Texas, and along the y-axis there, you have the Texas population growth or the total population of Texas in millions of people. And so you can see in the very beginning, 1870, we had a lot less than 1 million people living in Texas. But it's grown throughout the decades. If you just follow the blue line, very simple. You can see how it's grown to over 25 million, and it's projected, it's continuing at this rate, almost this exponential look to it, where it's growing exponentially, almost over 25 million. And this would continue that last graph into how many people might live in Texas up until 2040. So you see this growth. This line here kind of ends at 2010, and this is where we're at right here with 2010. Now the brown line, the brown kind of dash line here, is a estimated prediction if there was absolutely no migration. And if there was no migration into Texas, you can kind of see how this brown line would kind of not increase at all. It just kind of stand stagnant. You'd have kind of this natural increase due to natural birth and so forth like that. But migration really contributes to the population of Texas, and if there was no migration, this population would kind of stay the same. This next one, this red line, looks at the rate of growth from 1990 to 2000, and what would happen if Texas increased at the rate that Texas was increasing during the 1990s to 2000. And you can see that it really wouldn't grow as much. It would still grow a little bit. You'd still have a certain little rate of increase, but it wouldn't grow as much as it is today. Now this next one, this green line, is the prediction of how it would grow if it stayed at the rate that it was growing in 2000 to 2004. And then this dash line is for this purple line, forgive me. This purple line would be what if it grew at the rate that it did from 2000 to 2007. And then the blue dot line is how would it grow if it grew at the rate from 1990 to 2000. So if it grew at the rate that it did from 1990 to 2000, it would increase immensely. We would have a population of over 50 million during 2040, which I really wonder if the capacity of Texas could really handle it. But that being said, it tends to be growing at this purple line here, the rates from 2000 to 2007, and so it's projected, giving these estimates, in 2040 we'll have around 45 million people, which isn't that hard to imagine. 45 million people living in Texas really could happen. This is the overall numerical change. You can see how it increased in certain decades. So from the let's go ahead and look at 1960s to 1970s. From 1960 to 1970, it grew about 1 million people. And then from the 1980s, it grew 3 million people. So Texas really experienced this huge boom in 1980s. From 1990 to 2000, or sorry, during the 1980s, it grew around 2.7 million. 2000 it grew 3.8 million, and then in 2010, this is the most notable one. In 2010, it grew about 4.2 million people, and this is why Texas grew exponentially during this time. During that decade, Texas grew more than any other state. And in just 2 short years, in the 2010, from 2010 to 2012, it already grew 1 million. So or nearly 1 million. So if it grew at that rate over the next decade, so about 1 million times 5, it would grow about 5 million people. And Texas may be projected in 2020 to grow its overall number by 5 million people. Texas population is really, really taking off right now, and like I said, myself is kind of contributing to that, being from out of state. But also you have the foreign immigration flows, as well as the natural kind of increase in birth rates and so forth. So 5 million people in a decade could really kind of boost the population of Texas into numbers we've never seen before. Currently, the population kind of sits around 26 million. Adding 5 more million to that would make the population of Texas over 30 million by the end of 2020, which would be massive, quite big, and be one of the larger states. This chart here just kind of shows you that Texas indeed is growing faster than any other state. This is the population change between 2000 and 2010. And going back to this number, you can see that, going back one slide, you can see that Texas grew 4.2 million people. And that was more than any other state. The next closest state was California. California grew by 3.3 million. Texas grew by 4.2. So almost 1 million people more moved to Texas than moved to California, the next highest state. Other states experienced a lot of population growth, including Florida, Arizona, Virginia, Washington, other states like that. But Texas is still growing faster than any other state. This chart here really shows you the urbanization of Texas. You can see where most people in Texas live. So total estimated population by county in 2012. Looking at counties, you can see how many people really live there. And you have this little kind of triangle shape, this Texas triangle, I would call it, where the most people live. And so you have the Houston area right here, along with the Austin and San Antonio areas, and then the Dallas area. So many people are not only moving into Texas, they're moving into urban centers. And many people from the counties out here in the Panhandle in West Texas are moving in to these urban areas into Texas. It's very easy to move into these urban centers and get a good job and get a decent kind of living situation, because these urban centers provide these sorts of services. And so people that are moving into Texas, and people are migrating within Texas to these urban centers. And this is where most people live in Texas today, based on total amounts of population. Texas urban population, like I said, is really, really taking off. And you can see here the percentage of people that actually live in urban populations. Obviously, in the 1850s, Texas was a very agrarian and rural. Sorry, I always struggle with that word, rural. And they weren't living in urban centers. Houston was big, but it wasn't as big as it is today, obviously. Dallas was big. Austin was a decent-sized city. But they weren't really living in there. They still had their economic interests were still out in the open land, and there wasn't a really established economy in those centers. But kind of just going through the decades, you can see that currently around 85-86% of people live in Texas urban centers. So more and more Texans are moving to the city for new economic opportunities, and more people live in these urban centers than live in rural Texas now. This is the change of total population, and this will really show you that urban centers really are increasing while the West out here suffers. So red actually means that they lost people. They lost between 3,200 people to 0 people. So there was an actual negative. There was a loss of people. people are moving from these panhandle counties into the blue ones. The blue ones mean they gained. They gained over 100,000 people to 700,000 people. That's quite a bit of people. And they moved into these centers. You have the Austin, San Antonio, the Dallas, and the Houston areas. They moved into these areas for whatever reason. Meanwhile, people are moving away from West Texas. This kind of really signifies the change in Texas economy from agriculture into urban service sector, technology type companies, away from the agriculture, and that requires a move from West Texas to urban Texas, for lack of a better term. Still, some counties gained a few people, but not nearly as much as these urban centers. Maybe 1 to 10,000 people compared to 100,000 to 700,000 people. El Paso is the one town in West Texas that is still thriving. El Paso is still a large major hub, and obviously you have the growth of Juarez as well. So El Paso is one of the few counties out in West Texas that is actually growing, but many people are moving here. Also notable, sorry, I just noticed this, but also down here in the south, you have the growth because of immigration in South Texas. So it really just kind of shows you how the population of Texas is really, really changing from rural type agriculture to urban technology service sector type economy. This is total population by county in 2010. We've kind of already seen this graph more or less, but it still shows you the dark blue in Austin, San Antonio, and then Houston and Dallas areas. I believe you've already seen that one. Also, this is just the change of total population from 2010 to 2012. So this is just in 2 short years. You can see how many counties have really grown in just 2 short years, from 2010 to 2012. You can see these dark blues. In just 2 short years, the Houston and Dallas areas had nearly 80,000 to 161,000 people move in. In just 2 years, to have over 100,000 people move into your region is a massive population increase in such a short period. Austin and San Antonio are still thriving right here, while the west counties are not gaining as much. So that's the overall. Those are graphs for overall population. Let's go ahead and talk about the racial and ethnic composition of Texas, and this is what's very, very interesting to me. In a little over a decade, Texas became a minority-majority state. And what I mean by that is the minority population, if you take the minority population and group them all together, outweighs the white population, or what the former majority population. So the minorities now make up the majority overall. So in 2000, the white population, non-Hispanic white population, was still the majority. They held 53% of the total population, while Hispanics and then non-Hispanic blacks, non-Hispanic others were they were still minorities. They weren't overall the majority when combined together. But in over a decade, when Texas grew by about 4.2 million people, the white population is now the minority population. When you combine the minorities together into one group, they now outnumber the white population, which is very unique. This really just shows how diverse Texas is. Texas has a large Hispanic population. Texas has relatively a large Black and African American population compared to other states, and they now outnumber, when combined together, they now outnumber the whites. Now, this is very unique for me. Moving to Texas, I was very kind of caught off guard with really how just diverse Texas was. I always knew it was more diverse than Kansas. Obviously, moving in Kansas is not diverse at all. Whites probably comprise around 80% of the population in Kansas. So moving here, seeing a majority state, it's very interesting. There's so much diversity here in Texas, which really, I believe, contributes to the overall culture, and it can really contribute to the political landscape of Texas as well. So looking at other projected racial and ethnic presence, this is just projected numbers. No need to take these too seriously. But based on these projections, you can see that Texas, the Anglo population is projected to decrease, while the Hispanic population is projected to increase. So you can really see that Hispanics are growing at an ever-increasing rate. Going back one slide, you can see that Hispanics grew from about 32% of the population to 38% of the population. They grew 6% in just a decade. So it's going to be very interesting to see how much they grow in the decades to come. And according to these projections, based on the Texas State Data Center, you can see that Hispanics are projected to make up nearly 55, a little bit more than 55% of the overall population in Texas by 2040. That'll be very interesting to see a population of Texas that is a little over 55% Hispanic. Meanwhile, the Anglo population is projected to decline to around 25%, while the Black and other populations, Asian American populations, most likely are largely predicted to stay kind of stagnant. They'll stay the same. They'll stay around this kind of 10% margin by 2040. And so it's very interesting to see just how great the impact of the Hispanic population might be, and also mixed with the fact that Texas will not only be a minority-majority state, it'll be that will be even more pronounced in the decades to come. So let's go ahead and look at projected Texas population, these pyramids by race and ethnicity, 2010. So here you have Anglo male versus Anglo female, and you can see here that Anglo males and Anglo females are kind of around the male-female population is kind of split. It's kind of split evenly among all kind of demographics, all different age groups. But over here, you can see it breaks it down between Hispanic male, Black male, Hispanic male, Hispanic female, Black female, other male, other female, and you can really see that this Hispanic population, these blacks, this kind of black gray color right here, and then this kind of deeper blue color, is really expanding. It's really big, and it's really, as you get younger, it really kind of takes off. So that's when I mentioned how young the Hispanic population is. It's because they take up the majority of the population among the younger groups, the younger demographics. The Hispanic population is really young, and they kind of really bulge out here among the younger ages. So the Hispanic population is really young, and it'll continue to contribute to the population of Texas, particularly as they grow older and have their own kids and establish their own families and establish their own jobs here in Texas. The Hispanic population is really going to take off. So, percent of migrants to Texas, let's go ahead and look at domestic migration, international migration, and overall migration. So this first one here, this first column over here on the left-hand side, is net domestic migration. So people that move from another state into Texas, so domestically, within the United States. And for those that move from out of state into Texas, a lot of them are whites. The white population tends to move from out of state into Texas for economic opportunities. For me, it was because of school, anything like that. The white population really moves domestically into Texas. Hispanics are moving from out of state into Texas at around a rate of 28%, or overall percentage of 28%. The black population is also moving from out of state into Texas as well. The black population is moving from out of state into Texas, and they comprise approximately 23% of the overall net domestic migration. Other races are about 50%. International migration, coming from another country into Texas, you can see that whites don't really immigrate as much from another country into Texas. They tend to, the whites that are moving into Texas tend to be a result of domestic migration rather than international migration. But still, that being said, whites make up 24% of the overall international migration. And the Hispanic population, new Hispanics into Texas are really a result of international migration, most likely from Mexico and Central America. Those from Mexico and Central America and possibly even South America are internationally migrating into Texas. Black populations, I would probably say, are moving internationally, they comprise around 8% of the total international migration, and then 18% others. So those actually, I would most likely tag these as Asian Americans. Asian Americans are moving into Texas from other countries. That comprise around 18% of that overall total. So the total here, you can see that Hispanics contribute to the most to overall migration into Texas, and that's why the Hispanic population is really taken off. Whites comprise around 33% of the total migration. Blacks comprise around 15% of the total migration, and then others such as Asian Americans are contributing to the overall migration at around 12%. Notable down here is the numbers here. So net domestic migration between 2000 and 2009, you had around 848,000 total domestic migration, and you had 933,000 total international migration. So combine that and you had around 2 million overall migrants into Texas between 2000 and 2009. So it's very interesting, and 52% of all migrants were of international origin. So Texas is getting a lot of migration from both domestic sources, those that are moving from out of state into Texas, and also from international sources as well, from moving from another country into Texas, which is contributing to the overall population growth in Texas. So people moving from out of state and also people moving internationally into Texas are contributing to the overall migration into Texas and the overall population increase into Texas. And what's notable here is that Texas is actually really becoming a lot younger as well. So let's go ahead and look at this one here in terms of age. It's very interesting to note how young Texas is becoming as well. So this is the percentage of the population that is 65 years or older. And this red, whenever you see the red on the map, that means that there's not a lot of people that are elderly in those counties. There's not a lot of people that are 65 years or older in those counties, and those counties tend to be a lot younger. And it tends to be within the major urban hubs. So you have Austin, San Antonio over here, you have Dallas, and then you have Houston. Those tend to be the young urban hubs where young people are moving into. Also, you have in South Texas here, you have not a lot of young people because you have a lot of young immigrants coming from Mexico across the Mexican border. And so the fact that they're moving into South Texas makes those populations a lot younger as well. And then in West Texas over here in El Paso region, you have a lot of immigration flow as well, contributing to the youth within those populations. So Texas is becoming a lot younger. Like I said, it's becoming younger, it's becoming more progressive, it's becoming more urban. The youth are moving into the urban centers, and also they're contributing to the age. The youth are making Texas younger in terms of immigration as well. So people moving to Texas tend to be younger. Texas is therefore becoming younger and more progressive. And then finally, last chart here. This really shows how, even though we have this young population moving in, there's still a lot of disparity between income. There's a lot of income inequality in Texas, and there's also a lot of problems with access to education. While you have a lot of these immigrant workers, and you have a lot of young people moving to Texas, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to get a good education and a good job just because they moved to Texas. And you can see here that there's a huge disparity in educational attainment of young people here in Texas, and this is based on ethnicity. So breaking it down in terms of how the government breaks it down in terms of non-Hispanic white and then Hispanic. So among non-Hispanic whites, you can see that not a lot of them receive less than a high school diploma. Many of them actually do go on to this blue category here, where they at least get a high school diploma, or at least a GED, or a kind of an alternative equivalent. So but most non-Hispanic whites are able to actually obtain the white sector here, and that means at least some college or an associate's degree. So many of them at least receive some sort of post-secondary education, and a lot of them are actually able to reach this black sector here, where they are able to get a bachelor's degree or higher. Now that's for the non-Hispanic whites. Unfortunately for the Hispanic population here in Texas, many of them are receiving less than a high school diploma. They are able to get a high school diploma, GED or alternative at the same rate as non-Hispanic whites, but much or fewer of them are able to get to at least some college or some sort of post-secondary education, and very few of them are able to get bachelor's degrees or higher. And so this is contributing not only to the educational disparity here in Texas, but it's also contributing to the income inequality that's present here in Texas, because many Hispanics are not able to, or not reaching at least some college or higher, or at least a bachelor's degree. This is contributing to them getting lower service sector type jobs, and therefore making the income inequality even more pronounced here in Texas. So even though we have this large diversity here in Texas, it's really unfortunate that it's also contributing to the income inequality here in Texas. And income inequality is becoming it's becoming a huge issue here in Texas, and it's becoming much more prevalent. Income inequality is becoming much more prevalent here in Texas. So these are just a few charts to kind of show you how diverse Texas is, how it's becoming younger, more progressive, how the population is changing, and then also how this could influence the economy and incomes of Texans in the future as well. So that's enough of the charts. We're going to go ahead and just kind of review here real quickly. Some key points from today's lecture is that Texas population has increased significantly, and Texas population is always changing. There's migration moving into Texas, and then there's also just natural increase just from birth and creating families and things like that. And migration and natural increase are about equal. Texas is now the second most populated state behind California, and Texas population is predominantly urban. It's becoming predominantly urban, which is a huge change from where it was about a little over a century ago. The population is not distributed evenly. There are very few counties with a lot of people, and then there are a lot of counties with very few people. So the population is not distributed evenly. Obviously, the urban centers are really taking off, while West Texas tends to be kind of suffering a little bit. And then the fact that the growth of the population has been mostly in the urban corridors of Texas, San Antonio, Dallas, and Houston. And rural areas in West Texas have really lost population. So those are the key points from today, and particularly looking into the future of Texas, you're going to see how this urbanization really plays out and how this diversity plays out in Texas as well. And it could contribute greatly to Texas politics. And moving forward, we're going to look at Texas politics. And I would at least ask you to kind of consider how these demographics and these facts really play into the changing political landscape of Texas. So, what does all this mean in Texas politics? Well, the growth in Texas population could have an impact on the Texas political landscape. For one, is the Electoral College worth. The Electoral College elects the president. And so as you get more people moving into your state, you get more, you're worth more in the Electoral College. The Electoral College is the number of senators plus the number of House of Representatives members you have. Currently, Texas has 36 House of Representative members plus 2 senators, so Texas is worth 38 points now in the Electoral College. But as you gain more population, you get more congressional districts, and therefore you get more House of Representative members. The more House of Representative members you have, the more worth you have in the Electoral College. So Texas will become worth more in the Electoral College, and therefore to be worth more in presidential elections. So you're going to have more presidential candidates come into Texas and really battle for the number for that Electoral College worth in Texas. So that's one way it could influence the political landscape. The other one is I have the question here, good news for Democrats. Because Texas is becoming younger and more progressive and more urban, the population of Texas is tending to mirror, or at least side with, Democratic views and liberal views more often than it used to. And so Democrats could really have a chance to win Texas in the future. So Texas will become a kind of a swing state. It'll become a very important state in future presidential elections because you'll have this actual battle between Democrats and Republicans rather than Texas just voting for Republicans as it traditionally has in the last few decades. The other impact on the Texas political landscape it could have is, once again, just you're going to have this clash of traditional and modern views. You have the government of Texas that is still largely controlled by whites and Anglos that are wealthy enough and have the connections enough to win to win elections and control the apparatus of government. But these modern views are moving into Texas, and so they could kind of clash with the current traditionalistic type office holders. And so you have the government that's still largely controlled by these whites that are elected by kind of the traditional population, but these newcomers really could vote them out almost, and could really change how politics operates in Texas. The other thing with the changing political landscape here in Texas is you need to consider how local governments might change. You have urbanization, which is really taking off, and some local governments are really, really strained by the demands that are placed on them now. They're now having to govern more people than they ever have had before, and so this really becomes a question of administrative capacity, whether they have the capacity to handle this growth, this massive growth in population. We can, so I'll use the example here in Houston, or in Houston, I guess I should say, of Harris County. Harris County is one of the largest counties in the United States, and so they're having to hire more workers to take on the workload, and they're having to really oversee more cases and more problems than they ever had before. Meanwhile, while those counties are growing, others are becoming obsolete as they have little to govern. They have little to do, and it's going to be a question of whether we should continue to pay these county workers to do nothing, to really not do much, because people are moving away from those West Texas kind of counties. So other governments are kind of becoming obsolete, while other governments in Texas are becoming more strained. So local governments are going to really kind of feel the strain of this population growth, or at least feel a wind of change with the population growth here in Texas. All right, so that's enough of Texas history, and it's kind of a look into it's enough of Texas history. It's also enough of a look kind of in the future. So let's go ahead and talk about what the discussion board questions are for this week. The first question I really want you to answer is, I want you to look at the history of Texas, and I really want you to look at also kind of where Texas is today. And I want you to consider all the ethnic and racial kind of groups that came into Texas and contributed to the overall culture of Texas. But which of these new coming groups that came into Texas do you believe has had the largest impact on the culture of Texas? Which one can you kind of see? You can look at the culture of Texas today, and you can see maybe a Spanish influence or a French influence, or you can see a Mexican influence. You can see how important maybe the Americans were coming to Texas. Which one of these newcomers do you believe has had the largest impact on the overall culture of Texas? And how do you give me an example of how you've seen this in current Texas culture. Second question, I really want you to read page 28 of the textbook, and I want you to consider your hometown. Page 28 of the textbook talks about how diverse Texas is versus how non-diverse, lack of a better term, how little diversity there is in Vermont. So it compares Texas and Vermont, and it shows how diverse Texas is, while Vermont really isn't that diverse. Vermont typically is comprised of around 95% Anglos, or 95% whites. And so look at your hometown, and is your hometown more like Texas, or is it more like Vermont? Is your hometown have a lot of diversity, or does it tend to be only comprised of one racial or ethnic group? If you lived in several towns, and I understand that, I've lived in several towns, talk about how maybe you've witnessed the different levels of diversity. Myself, coming from Kansas, where there's no diversity, moving into Texas, where there's tons of diversity, I can tell you that the world is very different based on where you live, and the demographic makeup really changes based on how you live. Number 3 here, do you believe that the changing racial or ethnic makeup of Texas will have an impact on the political landscape? I want you to kind of think into the future. Do you really think that this growing Hispanic population or the growing young population, do you believe these types of groups will really make an impact on the political landscape, or do you think things will just kind of continue the way they are with whites dominating government and Anglos really controlling the offices of government? And in what ways do you think it'll change? And then if you don't believe that it'll make any impact at all, justify your answers. Tell me why these groups will not have an impact at all. So that'll conclude our week 2 lecture. I hope I haven't been too boring. Once again, if you have any questions, consult the help discussion board. I'll also be on Skype. I'm also free and available at any time. through email. So it was good talking to you guys today. Not really talking to you, I'm just talking to a camera. But it was really good to talk about these sorts of things, and I really look forward to your discussion board posts. So I'll go ahead and exit out of this, and we'll see you next week.